6 years after the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi, Libya remains unstable, divided and very violent. My guest this week is a senior advisor to the Government of National Accord, one of three so-called governments, but the only one that's recognized as legitimate by the outside world. He's Taher El-Sonni, and he's flown here specially to Tunis to appear on Conflict Zone. Can he ever imagine his country as a safe and fully functioning democracy? Taher El-Sonni, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Welcome, thanks, Tim.
You said a year ago that we have control, you, the Government of National Accord, have control of the state institutions and our opponents understand the game is over. That didn't happen, did it? You spoke too soon.
Well, I think fair to say that it was not an easy challenge that we faced since we came in. We came to Tripoli where we were actually with no force to manage what is there. We had to work things from scratch.
But these were grand statements that you made.
Absolutely.
Weren't they?
Absolutely.
We have control of the state institutions and our opponents understand the game is over. They haven't understood that at all, have they?
It's true, but we were talking basically about Tripoli, in particular the capital. The institutions in Tripoli, that's what we were looking for, because that's the key for the stability of Libya. The centralization, or the way that Libya working in, with all institutions more centralized in Tripoli, once you have control over that, things are much more easier to manage within the country.
But is false optimism the best thing that you can offer to Libyans? Don't they deserve a more honest assessment of what is going on?
No, but we were fair, and we are fair until now. I mean, you can see how things are shaping much better. Embassies coming back to Tripoli. The United Nations is coming back next month. This is good signs to show that we did manage to do well.
The United Nations just had a fruitless month of talks with the various factions involved in the fighting and the divisions inside Libya, to the point where nothing was agreed at the end of this month and no time frame was set to resume the talks either. So things aren't getting better, are they? In fact, the chief prosecutor at the ICC said earlier this year, the International Criminal Court, the situation is both dire and unacceptable. Reports indicate that the country is at risk of returning to widespread conflict.
That's exactly the reason why the Prime Minister has launched his roadmap around June, July, to propose the best way forward with all of these challenges. We were thinking that in a certain point that these amendments to the political agreement will take place. Many had hopes for that, but we predicted that will not be possible. So that's why we were calling for elections next year. And it's not that it's going to be maybe the easy way forward, but it's the best way, we think, to unite institutions that are divided all around the country. It's something that we inherited by coming from the LPA that was signed in Sarraj. So we are trying
the Libyan peace agreement.
Yes, correct.
But just a month ago, we had the UN envoy, Hassan Salameh, saying, you're talking about institutions. Libya has sleeping institutions that need to be woken, divided institutions that need to be united, and hijacked institutions that need to be rebuilt. So you're nowhere near either waking up these institutions or controlling them, are you?
Correct, because we are a divided country. And that's why we need to unite it.
And this is 6 years. This
Absolutely.
is 6 years, and no progress, no discernible progress has been made.
That's absolutely correct. It's a joint responsibility, whether it's from the Libyans, which it's priority, and the international community that left just Libya after 2011. I mean, they were fully engaged in the conflict in 2011, and then all of a sudden just lifted their hands and thought things were going to go normal.
It's easy to blame somebody else, isn't it?
But that's why I said it's a joint responsibility. But it's a fact. The weapons that have been coming in all the time, UN Sanctions Committee and their reports are reporting these weapons that are coming into illegal forces. And nobody even stepped forward against that. We are the legitimate government. We didn't manage to even actually build our
Well, you say you're the legitimate government, and you're recognized outside the country as the legitimate government, but
True.
You're very much the disputed government inside the country.
Because this is an agreement that was not respected. I mean, again, this is the problem. When you have a 1 year and a half or a year and a half agreement that has been between Libyans, which was signed in Sarraj, putting the assumption that these political parties will sit together and unite their institutions and try to build a common future for Libya. And then we end up with the way we ended up, with not respecting it. with regional players also being
involved. So you're
involved.
part of the problem. You're not part of the solution, are you?
No, but
perhaps it's time after all this time to step aside and let somebody else have a go. Because you're not being successful in uniting the country, in taking over the institutions, in bringing law and order, in doing something about the terrible state of the economy. None of that is improving under your government, is it?
You have to look into carefully to the Libyan political agreement, what it says. It says that the responsibility...
Looking at the reality on the ground.
Yeah, no, but this is the
reality
point.
On the ground. Never mind what it says on a piece of paper.
When there's a united government in the country, and there's a way to have the proper methods taken into consideration, these things could be resolved. When you have two central banks...
You have three governments. You have three governments.
Yeah,
you have two parliaments.
But this is not the problem of the current
you have 9 members of a presidential council as well who are feuding constantly amongst each other. A House of Representatives, a Libyan investment authority. Control of that is disputed.
But this happened before we even came in.
Well,
that's the challenge. And that's why they're having...
It's happening now and you haven't done anything about it. I mean, you take the National Oil Commission, for instance. The chairman, who has stated on the record that he doesn't regard your government as legitimate.
No, that's not true.
He has. He wrote in June that your national government of accord had attempted to take over the organization's most important functions, but was blocked by a court in Benghazi. And he said, we intend to remain neutral until there is a single legitimate government we can submit to.
Let me clarify that for you.
And he's saying that there isn't. He clarified it himself.
No, but you have to know the reality of this. The National Oil Commission has certain responsibilities that it inherited to fill in the gap that there was no oil ministry. Now, oil ministry is something that is under the government institution or under the management of the government. This is something that they took on the years past when there was no oil ministry. When we came in, we only asked to take, as a government, these responsibilities. They cannot put the policies of Libya towards the oil companies and how to deal with it.
But they don't trust you as a government. They don't regard you as a legitimate government.
No.
This is the guardian of the most important resources that Libya has.
Yeah, but that's
and
not
they're
true.
saying they're waiting
all
for a single legitimate government, which they don't yet have.
All the wealth of the oil is coming through the government, and we are distributing it in the country. If that was true, we wouldn't have been able to do that. International community...
He wrote this in June. He wrote this in June.
No, that's not the way he said it. That's not the context.
That's the quote. I'm taking the quote.
And if that was the case, how come then all the revenue is coming through the GNA, through our government? How come that we're able to sell all the oil revenue if that was the truth? That's not in the context of how things happen.
Prime Minister Sarraj blames the UN now for not unfreezing the country's assets, in particular the Sovereign Wealth Fund, worth some $67 billion.
Well,
he told the UN Libya needed the assets to sustain itself. That's what he said.
The UN, the Libyan frozen assets, we did not call for unfreezing it because we know that it's not the time for that. We called for unfreezing the management of the frozen assets. It's totally different. We're losing $1 billion a year because we're not able to manage it, not to unfreeze it. We know we're not in a steady state to unfreeze these assets. And that's what we called for in the UN and in the UN Sanctions Committee.
It's not money that's going to sustain Libya,
of course.
It's unity. It's unity of purpose, compromise, democracy, the things that you don't have. And these are the main problems.
True.
Why you don't have an economy at the moment that's properly functioning.
Because we're a divided country that has divided institutions. Sovereign institutions are divided. When you talk about two central banks divided, it's not the responsibility of the government to unite the central bank. It's a sovereign thing that is related to the House of Representatives and the State Council according to the Libyan political agreement. This is the legislative body that is responsible of this sovereign institution.
But it doesn't help when the Prime Minister keeps promising more than he can actually deliver, does it?
As what?
In September, he told the UN that all Libyan parties were ready to deal with the challenges facing the country. That's simply not true, is it?
Ready to deal with it doesn't mean that it's resolving it. That's why we're having these talks.
We just had 3 weeks fighting earlier in October around an oil and gas installation west of Tripoli.
Absolutely.
We had the airport closed on the second, third week in October.
any country with
With
conflict,
fighting around the airport.
when there's spread of weapons all around the country, that's the challenge we're facing. We're doing DDR programs in order to resolve this, but we cannot do it with one hand.
6 years, and there's still
We weren't
fighting
here 6
around
years.
the airport.
We weren't 6 years here.
I'm not saying you are, but
Yeah.
this is where we are.
And that's what
6
we're trying to
years
resolve.
after the overthrow of Gaddafi.
The advantage we did by coming in this timing is to save Libya a real civil war. If you look at the amount of weapons spread out in all cities in Libya, and you see the number of conflict that happened around, whether you talk about Tripoli and all other cities, we're actually saved Libya a lot. It doesn't mean we resolve the problems, but it's like staying on the balance of an edge. You know, it's very hard to maintain your balance on a rope when you're walking on it, but it's still challenging.
You have a worsening cash crisis, you have black market currency exchanges, smuggling, power outages,
Absolutely.
and violence, as we were talking about.
Absolutely.
But you're not doing anything about these things.
No, but you're claiming we're not doing.
You seem very complacent about this.
No, because when you know where your responsibilities hold, a government has other institutions in all the world that are responsible for certain things. We don't put the monetary policies that will solve the problem of the black market. That's the central bank role. We don't have an oversight on the central bank.
So what's the point of having a government then?
Government, that's the point. You cannot work alone.
You're not supposed to be. You're supposed to be holding these institutions to account.
We don't
a government has overall control.
No executive power.
Which is what you said a year ago, that we have control of the state institutions.
Not the sovereign institutions.
My contention has been that you haven't.
No sovereign institutions in the world have authority. That's the separation of power. We cannot interfere in that part. We can put policies for economy, but we cannot interfere, for example, on how to, we can give advice on how to change the issue of the exchange rate, for example, or the devaluation of the dinar. But we cannot apply it if the central bank and other authorities that are sovereign are not actually accepting it.
While you make these arguments, people in Libya are losing hope, aren't they? The published polls by the Libya Herald, October the 18th, showed a massive 91% of people accusing the government of failing to deliver on the aims of the revolution. 92% believing that corruption is actually worse now than it was.
I agree with these figures, and this is inherited from the past 7 years. So if you're talking to me about the story and telling me the story about 7 years, I would fully agree with you. And this is the post-conflict, as in other countries, when there was a centralized dictatorship, centralized on a person, and without proper institutions, and collapse all of a sudden, with weapons spread around. This is the typical result you get. And that's why we've been going into talks. The political awareness to the people is minimum because they never got a chance to even be vocal about what they want and to express themselves. This is a new phase in Libya.
But you're not offering people anything that they can believe in. We have more people apparently supporting Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, 10%, than have faith in a consensus government, 7%. So there's a huge lack of faith in your government.
This percentage is fair because there was 40 years of ruling with one party, so definitely he will have this number of supporters, if not even more.
Oh, well, maybe you should let him rule then.
That's not the point. That's why we want elections. And when we have elections and fair elections, let people choose who they want. This is the first person and the only person who called for free elections was President al-Sarraj, even as early as March. If we wanted to stay in power, we wouldn't have called for this. But you see that so many others are opposing it because they know they're going to lose their chair. But we're not looking that way. We're not thinking that way.
What chance is there of having elections when you can't even agree on drafting a constitution?
That's why I'm telling you, if you're talking to me as a government, that's something we're not involved in. If you're talking as a Libyan, I would tell you that a constitution has been offered. There is a dispute in the courts in terms of the mechanism that it was rolled out. It has been going on for 3 years now.
There were gunmen that raided the Constitutional Assembly on the day when they actually voted.
Which is crazy. That's exactly
the
problem.
And the government isn't responsible for providing security?
Because this is on the east. We're not controlling the east. That was on the eastern side. This is other people. This is the division of Libya. You have to look at the geography.
And General Haftar, who controls the east?
That's the fact.
You had negotiations with him, only sporadic negotiations with him, but they haven't brought any progress there, have they?
No, they did. That's why they had a joint statement in Paris and Saint-Cloud where they both called for elections. The problem is that
Hours later, Haftar changed his mind, didn't he? Reuters quoted him as saying, any ceasefire was limited, he had no interest in elections, and Mr. Sarraj's government of national accord, which is what you represent here, was in the grip of terrorists. So much for the agreement that you got in Paris.
No, I think that the way to put it is that there's a problem of trust all around Libya and with special figures as well. But what is good is that if you look at the people, not the politicians, they all want a new stage and a new start, which is something around the elections, a new parliament and a new executive body that is separate from the legislative. The problem that happened in Libya, the biggest mistake since 2011, all the bodies that came in, whether it's the Transitional Council, whether it's called the General Assembly, whether it's called the House of Representatives, mixed the executive power with the legislative. So the president of this house is the president, has executive power as well, which messed up all Libya.
How can you possibly have elections when you haven't got security? You need security as a prerequisite to elections. Today, you don't have an oversight body for elections. You don't have an entity that's going to provide people with the security for knowing that these would be fair elections.
That's a good point. That's a good point. The security today is not worse than what it was in 2014, where we had elections. What we're saying is that the UN and the international community, this is our advice, should bring back the momentum and have these political talks rather than talking about LPA amendments, to divert it towards advocacy for these elections and having the stability to reach a credible election.
Do you really think that whichever side loses these elections is going to accept it? Because everywhere you look, there is a failure by Libyans to see beyond their own factional interests, isn't there?
It's something that we have to go through. There's no guarantee, that's true.
An inability to think of the good of the nation rather than the good of themselves. Boris Johnson, British Foreign Secretary, who visited recently, summed it up, didn't he, when he said politicians in Libya need to suppress their own selfish interests and compromise for the good of the country. But they're nowhere near doing that.
There's no country that came out of dictatorship for 40 or more years, never had the chance for proper democracy, and you expect it to come in day and night and understand what even democracy means.
But they certainly did in Eastern Europe when they emerged from the East Bloc.
It wasn't something easy as well. They had their conflicts and they had their problems.
They weren't fighting around the airport 6 years after the revolution.
That's not the point.
They weren't.
There are conflicts all around the world. If you go to Latin America, if you go to Africa, these are countries that went through these similar phases. Libya is a unique case as well. The way it was ruled was very unique. Everyone knows that. What I'm trying to say that in order to achieve a democracy, you need more democracy. You cannot say that because I'm not sure about the security situation, we don't fix it and we don't have elections. That's not the way. We tried for 2 years.
So you'll have contested elections and then you'll have fighting about that. Really, where does that get you?
That's the point. The dynamics now are different. The armed groups and those militias are exhausted. It's a different, even regional players have their different
Mr. El-Sonni, they've been fighting around the airport this month. This
is the point. You
They're
have
not
to
exhausted
understand,
at all.
You have to understand what part of this was, what type of conflict this was. There are a lot of problems. This is a criminal act that was around the airport, for you to know, and you can check that out. It was not a political-driven armed group. This is something that was cleaning up criminals. We have that all around. I'm not denying the fact that we have a challenge. We have arms in every single home. Well, this is a problem.
Perhaps, Mr. El-Sonni, perhaps democracy just isn't for you. Perhaps it isn't for you. Perhaps.
Name me one country that ended up with democracy in your part of the world that did not go in a civil war. This is something.
Look at the rest of the Arab world. What happened to the Arab Spring? We have strongmen in all these countries, dictators, authoritarian. Isn't this what's going to happen in Libya as well?
But this is the point. That's what I was saying. After true dictatorship for decades, this is what you get as a result, because it's a sudden collapse, and people are not used to it.
But there are not enough people here, at least on the surface. It doesn't seem as though there are enough people here to put aside their own interests and worry about the common good. Isn't that the problem?
That is one of the problems. It's not the only one. The negative interference from regional players and international players and the competition by these countries in Libya as a proxy to their own issues is a dramatic issue that is causing us a lot of trouble. If they just lift their hands from Libya and let us deal with it, we might have been in a better shape.
Isn't that just looking around for someone else to blame?
Tell me where the weapons come from. Do you think these are the weapons of Gaddafi? No. That's a serious issue.
Mr. El-Sonni, apart from your own internal politics and internal squabbles and violence, there are huge concerns about your treatment of migrants here in Libya. In February, EU leaders agreed to a controversial plan to stem the flow of migrants from Libya. But we've seen them subject since then to massive abuse. And your Coast Guard actually sometimes shoots at them. I mean, what kind of treatment is this? What kind of humanity is this from Libya?
First of all, you're putting issues that are not necessarily the full facts. I will tell you, for example, when all Europe is talking about fighting or combating illegal migration, where they're coming out of their countries and their ultimate target is to reach Europe, not Libya. We're just a passage. And we're a country of conflict. We're a country divided. We have limited resources. How do you expect us to deal with this flood where even Europe is not able to manage it? If they're not
You're
willing
saying
to accept
that because you don't have sufficient resources, your coast guards are actually
no, that's not true. That's
shooting
not true. That's not
at
true.
refugees?
That's not true. That's not true.
Well, this is from the High Commissioner for Human Rights last month, Zaid Rad al-Hussein.
He never said that we were shooting.
He said, you have a coast guard that sometimes rescue migrants. This is his exact quote. You have a coast guard that sometimes rescues migrants in distress, but sometimes chooses not to. Like the militias on shore, coast guards also sometimes beat, rob, and even shoot the migrants they intercept. This is a direct quote from him.
Let me tell you the facts.
You're saying he knows nothing?
No, I didn't say he knows nothing. I said we don't shoot migrants. What we're doing is trying to apply our sovereign rules and regulations, and by saving their lives and bringing them back. This is an international agreement. This is an EU-Libya agreement. Why Sophia is there? What does Sophia operations do then? Why are they on why don't they let the migrants go to Italy and to Europe?
But Mr. El-Sonni, it's not part of the agreement to beat them up and abuse them in detention camps.
Nobody said we'd do that.
Médecins Sans Frontières says the detention of migrants is rotten to the core, a thriving enterprise of kidnapping, torture, and extortion. Migrants are locked up, women and girls are being beaten and raped by the guards, men are being beaten up.
There are definitely...
This is under your care. In this country.
No, let me put it this way. There are definitely some certain occasions where some things like this could happen. Again...
They did happen. That people don't make these stories up.
I said it could happen, but it's not the norm. It's not the... Look at the numbers. Look at the numbers in front of the challenges that we have. Look at the... When you talk about 200,000 migrants coming into Libya, and nobody's looking about protecting our southern border. They're only looking at the shores of Libya. That's where the international responsibility should come in. That when they're not giving us enough resources, where we're divided, we have frozen assets, we don't have the funds even to build in detention centers that we can work on.
I understand
These
that,
are
but
challenges.
does that excuse the abuse that is being meted out?
I'm just telling you that the more numbers you have,
but you
the
seem
more
to be
challenges.
offering me this information as an excuse
I'm giving
as
you
to why they're beaten up and abused.
I'm giving you the facts that will cause a lot of problems, that we don't have the resources even to manage these detention centers all around Libya.
They cause a lack of humanity that this illustrates?
No. This is something that proves that we are in a serious trouble, that we need a lot of support to fix the conflict in Libya.
How is it that you people can treat migrants this way? People treated with such incredible cruelty. People have nothing, who are fleeing persecution, who are fleeing war, trying to get somewhere else, and yet they're beaten up and raped in your detention centers.
It's not something that is common. Don't show it as if it's something all around. It is cases. There are cases which we don't accept. That's true. But look at the bigger picture. Look how many lives we saved. Look how many. This is recognized even with the same resources you have.
And you don't think this is damaging to your reputation as a country?
It's something that we don't accept. And we have Libyans that
are
also part of this.
What are you doing about it? It's easy to say you don't accept it. What are you doing about it?
That's the issue. We have our Ministry of Interior working on it. We have our civil society working and supporting it. We allow all international organizations to work and support in these detention centers. IOM and UNHCR are there supervising. That's the best we can do now, and we're doing our best in it. But what I'm telling you, it's a massive thing that even European countries who are well-steady states could not fix. I want to ask you, why are they not focusing on the root cause of these migrants? You're looking at the outcome, definitely a problem. Human rights abuses is something we don't accept. But how do we resolve it? Only by the final stage where they reach Libya, or we look why did they come from the first place there? It's something that is related to our economy in their countries, where Europeans can invest in.
Again, you're trying to tell me it's someone else's fault.
I'm saying it's a collective.
You're not accepting responsibility.
It's a collective responsibility. No, I am saying it's a collective responsibility.
You are accepting responsibility for what happens here?
We should, as a government, respect. That's why we're fixing it. But what I'm saying is that it's a collective responsibility. You just don't look at one part of the story. You have to look at it all over. You're talking about a country with 3 governments, as you said, with arms all around, with terrorism all around. We're fighting all of this on behalf of the world. We have migrants all over. We have organized crime. This is something that not just a government can easily handle by its own, even if we're united. It needs support from all over.
This is 6 years
Absolutely.
after the revolution.
Yes.
6 years on. Can you really honestly imagine anything approaching a functioning democracy in Libya?
Absolutely. Because
How?
because the history,
What are the steps? How do you get
history
there?
says so. That the more you go on...
It doesn't say that about Libya. History doesn't say that about Libya, does it?
So there's
doesn't
no
say it
countries
about
that
the Arab
went...
world, does it?
No, I mean, there are countries in the Arab world that went in a better phase than us because they had institutions to start with. Tunisia and Egypt is an example. Even though they went through the Arab Spring, but they were managed to stand on their feet, and they didn't have an armed conflict.
Tunisia is the last country that has a shred of democracy in the Arab world.
That's what I'm trying to say. I'm talking about the amount of conflict and crisis that we're facing. Look at the nature of the way these countries were ruled. When you look at Yemen, you look at Iraq, you look at Syria, you look at Libya.
How many more years for Libya? How many more years for Libya? Is this going to go on, this chaos, this violence?
No,
how long?
I don't think it's going to take long, but I'm talking about, I think 5 to 10 years in order for us to have a steady state and a stable state, to be realistic.
Taher El-Sonni, it's good to have you on Conflict.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.